Welcome back. You're watching HFO-TV.
Welcome back to HFO-TV. I'm Greg Frick, partner here at HFO Investment Real Estate. And today joining us we have Scott Bailey, State of Washington Economist. And we're going to talk a little bit about the Washington economy, specifically Clark County, which is right across the river from us. Well, thank you again for coming.
Pleasure to be here.
I know I'm hoping most of the 2016 data is kind of coming in. Maybe give me a kind of an overall state of how Clark County is doing in relation to, the other counties in Washington, and maybe also in relation to the four-county area in Portland.
Right. Well, things have been really strong in Clark County in terms of job creation.
Right.
So we've been growing 4.5% over the year, which is faster than the metro area, which is now down to about 3%.
Right.
And even going back to, I do a graph that shows, right before the recession to where we are now. Clark County's up almost 15% compared to before the recession versus 10% for the metro area.
For jobs?
And 5% for the nation. So
wow.
Rapid growth, very diversified. Construction is the hottest industry, but really just about every industry is up over the year.
Any other industries other than construction that have kind of surprised you in terms of the amount of growth since the recession?
Well, it's been a different kind of growth than historically. I mean, if you go way back, Clark County is sort of the blue collar part of town, but especially the last couple of years, we've had a number of large employers who are much more management professional jobs. So the headquarters for Peace Health Hospital Network moved their headquarters there a couple of years ago. Most recently, Banfield Pet Hospital moved their headquarters from Portland to East Vancouver.
Okay.
Fisher Investment in Camas
right.
Continues to expand. Those are very well-paid jobs, managing a huge investment fund. So and in Vancouver, there's a small but growing network of small techie kind of startups.
Firms, okay. So you're getting kind of the spillover from Seattle and the spillover from Portland.
Yeah. That we haven't, really didn't have that before, but that's popped up in the last couple of years. Really exciting to see.
So has the wage growth then kind of followed that when you've got more managerial jobs? You've seen, kind of a band, that middle band has expanded faster than the other segments?
It's actually the top.
The top end, okay.
The top end has expanded rapidly, and then sort of the slightly below median has expanded rapidly.
Got it.
And this past year, 2015 is the last year I've really detailed wage growth data. But usually the pattern has been a lot of growth on the upper end, not so much on the middle and lower.
Right.
It was across the board, so the bottom 10% jobs went up at about 3% above inflation. That's
okay.
Adjusted for inflation. The top end was like 2.5, but it was across the board.
Across the board. No, that's good. Okay.
So that's a tightening labor market, lifting all boats at least this year, and I expect 2016 probably the same thing.
What about immigration? We hear about that in Portland and Oregon about how much immigration. You've seen the same numbers of immigration into Clark County?
Yeah. There's been pretty steady job growth. Not as percent-wise, not as spectacular as the mid-90s.
Right.
But pretty solid.
And what is this? And then that always leads right to then housing, which kind of we're involved with a lot. What are you seeing in the housing sector? In Clark County? So
it's recovered somewhat, but isn't where it was in terms of number of units permitted over the year.
Okay.
And in fact, 2016 was down. The preliminary numbers are down slightly from 2015, a little higher in single family, a little lower in multifamily. So it's still a very tight market in apartments, and rents have been going up and up and up, and it's especially difficult. This is all over the Northwest, right?
Right.
We're not seeing low-income housing being built in any great numbers, or family family apartments either. So that's still very, very tough.
So you're seeing that same pressure as you're seeing, like I said, I think it's all over the Northwest.
I've been out in the gorge the last couple of weeks around economic development planning, and that's housing is just huge there, or lack thereof. So the housing's up, but not where it was, and we're same as the Northwest or as Portland Metro in terms of single family, a really low inventory.
Right.
And that's driving housing prices up.
Gotcha. And is there a feeling, and we're feeling it here in Portland? Are you getting the same thing from the state capitol and looking at ways, legislative-wise, to deal with that? Is that rumbling because of how tight it is, or not yet? The more coming in Seattle.
That I don't know. What's going on? I expect they're talking about some things, but I don't know. City of Vancouver has been talking about trying to take some measures.
Got it.
But nothing has really bubbled up yet in terms of a.
And then on the employment side, is it? Are you seeing it same kind of across the board in all sectors? Like you said, it used to be manufacturing. Now you're seeing tech. Is it? Are those numbers still continuing based on what you've seen, or? Yeah,
there's a few industries that are low growth, but construction's up, manufacturing's up about 3% over the year, which is pretty decent.
Right.
Considering productivity and the high value of the dollar and that kind of thing. Retail's a bit slow, and I think, like everywhere else, it's being hit by online.
Right.
But professional, technical services up, healthcare.
Those across the board as well.
Restaurants.
Well, always funny about Vancouver is retail. Is how I was always asking somebody about retail is how far does a big box store need to be off the border with the sales tax to make it make sense?
Right. Well, less and less. I mean, there's that Fred Meyer right on right off of 14 now, so it's shrunk a bit.
Right, and as you get more immigration coming in, you've got bigger populace of people. I'm imagining that's going to continue to shrink. Yeah. Just from a convenience factor.
There's still, with a third of the county working over in Portland, there's still quite a bit of leakage. So you could say, well, there's upside potential for more retail there.
Right.
I think that's certainly true.
And is that a high percentage historically to have a third coming across the river from Portland?
It's been steady for a couple of decades.
It has been. Right. So there's never been a big jump one way or the other. Okay.
No, I think capacity-wise, we're going to see that shift in a bit, but and just the bridge traffic.
Right. So as the immigration's coming in, that same percentage is actually still living there, working across the river.
Yeah.
But we may see. I kind of predict. I think we will see a change where that number gets smaller as you've got more people living and working.
Yeah.
Just due to
that's what I would expect.
Right.
Or a little more of a two-way. So there's probably 65,000 plus coming from Vancouver, and maybe 15,000 people like me going the other direction.
Going up the other. Got it.
So like Washington County used to be mostly one way, and now it's
both.
It's jammed both ways.
Right.
So.
From an economic standpoint, are there anything? I mean, what are you looking for in this year? I mean, from a not saying get your crystal ball, but is there kind of trends that maybe you're looking at saying, well, if this continues, this is what we may see in 17 when we're sitting down talking in 18 about what last year looked like?
Yeah, so I think the sentiment is Portland and Oregon to a certain extent have sort of crested, and the state economists in Oregon are expecting things to sort of slow a bit. And we're seeing that in the numbers already. So I would expect the same would be true for Clark County because we're pretty joined at the hip.
Right.
With I think one or two exceptions. One is we're getting a new casino in 2 months in April with 1,000 jobs. So that's going to goose the job numbers right there.
And that'll be within Clark County. That's
in Clark County. So that's right off of I-5 by La Center. It's the Cowlitz Tribe. It's going to be a beautiful facility.
So that's going to boost your employment numbers right off for 17.
And the second thing is the waterfront development that's going on now along the Vancouver waterfront. So
just north of, just west of the I-5.
Yeah. Just right off the bridge. So with apartments and retail and restaurants going in there as sort of stage one for a much more ambitious proposal. And I think we'll see spillover of effects into beautiful downtown Vancouver. I say that a little jokingly because, wow, when I started working there 20 plus years ago,
it was a little,
I saw the potential.
Yes, so did I, yes.
But it was a matter of what was going to get the ball rolling.
Right.
And the city has done really incredible work over those last 2 decades to
kind of get this going.
Do enough to get things going. There's a Hilton with a conference center downtown. The city actually owns the Hilton.
Oh, I did not know.
Yeah, they leased it out. It's the only arrangement like that in the world for Hilton. But that was, one thing the city did to say, hey, we're gonna make things happen here, and it's really paid off. So I think there's going to be, this is long term, more interest in saying, Vancouver. For some companies, it'll be a better tax situation.
Right.
You get more, Class A office space downtown. We've seen more and more nice restaurants, brew pubs, that kind of thing going in downtown.
Well, it's good. You know, we've kind of said it's that waterfront development may be the spur, because I think 20 years ago or even 10 years ago, a lot of what was going on, even if you go a little east of the bridge, it was kind of different retirees. We had a lot of retirees moving there from the tax standpoint, but as things get tight in Portland, and you're looking for kind of tertiary outside of the core, so to speak, and where, I think you're going to get startups up there from an affordability standpoint. I mean, if I'm paying $35 for rent for an office and I can get it there for $20, am I going to go there? That's going to put a younger demographic, which kind of, you said, it's kind of broad-based, and eventually, I think you said you'll have less people coming across. You'll be able to get everything in Vancouver, so to speak, and so that's kind of what we think as well. It's just going to take some time.
Right. And I think the other thing long term that's really helping the county is the expansion of Washington State University's campus.
Yes.
Up in Salmon Creek,
yes.
And they're getting really engaged with businesses there. They just won some award for around their engagement there. So I think that's just a real positive going forward.
So is the growth, are you seeing more growth in Clark? Is it going up, is it going north as opposed to used to be, going east to Fisher's Landing and Camas, Washougal, and now you see heading up Salmon Creek and going that direction?
Yeah, so Ridgefield, there's been a fair amount of housing development there. Right. And then Battleground is sort of in the middle, and that's been growing like crazy. So it's really kind of all things going north and east and northeast. Right.
Okay. Well, thank you again for coming, giving us an update. It's been very informative. Thanks again for joining us on HFO-TV. And I think to sum it up, Vancouver and Clark counties have the kind of same growth as we've seen in the Portland area. And so I was telling a developer, the Northwest has been hot. I think if we underestimated anything, it was the amount of immigration we're going to see into this region, and now we're kind of getting the causes of that with shortages of housing and things like that. But it's been interesting to see kind of the country kind of shift over this way, and it seems everybody wants to move here. So, yeah, thank you.
Okay, thanks.
See you next time on HFO TV. Thank you.
Our entire office specializes in multifamily real estate, making HFO the largest multifamily brokerage in the Pacific Northwest. Your success is our passion. Build your legacy with HFO. Call 503-241-5541 or visit our website at hfore.com for more information.